Hey everyone, welcome to the channel for another Escape From Tarkov video. This time taking a look at some new M4A1 builds for the 12.9 patch, after many of the attachments in the game had their stats changed, sometimes pretty drastically. The M4 is pretty much as good as it's always been, but some things are a little different about the builds in 12.9. For starters, suppressors are now the de facto best in slot recoil attachments. Gas blocks actually have recoil reduction stats now, and your choice of stock for good recoil builds has pretty much completely changed. While the overall recoil of the M4 hasn't really changed that much, the cost has definitely gone up across the board for a good recoil build. Cheap stocks with good stats are a thing of the past, upgraded receivers are sort of a must-have, and the necessity of having a suppressor raises the cost of pretty much any build. For this video, I've got 3 builds for you. One for the mid-game before you unlock level 3 traders across the board, a mid-tier build showing some of the upgrades available once you hit level 30, and finally the new meta recoil build using level 4 traders. Keep in mind that these aren't the only 3 good M4 builds. In fact, you can make tons of good builds yourself with the M4 because there is a ton of options. These are just 3 builds that I have created for different stages of the game using parts that I think are the most cost effective or the most useful. So with that intro out of the way, let's get into the builds, starting with an update to the classic ADAR to M4 conversion build for the 12.9 patch. First up, we'll take a look at a build that I've been using for quite some time once I hit level 20 and unlock mechanic level 2. This lets you take an ADAR, or at the very least use a cheap ADAR barrel, and set up an M4 by putting the parts onto an M4 receiver. This build is one of the more cost-effective ways to make an M4, and it has fairly balanced stats in both recoil and ergonomics. It doesn't need any level 3 traders except for Peacekeeper, but that is kind of a necessity for running M4s in the first place. To start off, you can either take an ADAR you already have or one off the market, then remove the barrel and sell everything else back to mechanic. Alternatively, you can simply buy the 406mm barrel from Skier or off the flea market, because it's really the only part that you need from the ADAR, though it is the most expensive part. Next, head over to mechanic level 2 and buy the M4A1 lower receiver for 20,000 rubles, which then allows you to start dropping parts onto it to make the build. For the upper receiver, you can either use the ADAR upper if you bought one for the build, or alternatively, you can search the flea market for the lightweight upper receiver for the TX15, which gives you a slight stat increase for a pretty reasonable price. You also want the MK12 low profile gas block, which not only clears up your sight picture, but also reduces your recoil now, which is a nice little bonus. Next, go to Peacekeeper level 2 and buy the KAC QDC compensator. Slap that on the rifle and then search the flea market for the NT4 suppressor. There's 2 colors of this, so buy whichever is cheapest and add that as well. The handguard on this build is the MOE SL mid-length handguard from Skier level 2, which is one of the better options available at this level without gambling on the flea market price. For the grip on this, I have the AFG M-Lock grip from Peacekeeper level 3, but you can always just buy an M-Lock rail from mechanic and add the RK4, RVG, or something similar if you want. I've also got a 2.5 inch M-Lock rail here so I can add the X400 flashlight, but you can replace this with whatever you prefer in this slot. The pistol grip on this build is the Hogue rubber grip, which is pretty cheap and improves your ergonomics pretty nicely. I've also got the HK extended latch charging handle for 1 more point of ergonomics. The stock on this build is the Chris DS150 stock, sold by Peacekeeper level 2. This one is pretty nice for the price, and since the MFT BUS stock was nerfed in 12.9, I think this might be the way to go for cheap M4 stocks with decent stats. Finally, for the sight on this build, I just went with a simple Cobra reflex sight, which is very cheap from Proper, and you can add the shade attachment to gain some ergonomics points, which is a nice touch as well. When it's all put together, this build has 56 recoil and about 56 ergonomics as well. It's pretty balanced between the 2 stats, and I think this might be the first patch where an early game M4 build actually has better stats than an early game AK build. For the overall cost, this setup will run you around 150,000 rubles, varying slightly depending on the market prices and whether you need to buy the ADAR barrel or just use ones that you found on scavs. I used this build quite a bit during the early wipe in 12.9, and it worked quite well for me. Plus, with a few upgrades as you level up using parts from the other builds in this video, this build stays pretty competitive without getting too expensive. Next up, we're going to take a look at a pretty solid mid-tier setup that'll get you under 50 recoil while still having decent ergonomics. This build requires level 3 traders and has a few parts from level 4 Peacekeeper. However, they aren't essential parts and can be replaced by lower level attachments without losing too much in terms of stats. For the base of this build, I'm just going with a stock M4 purchased off the flea market with the 370mm barrel for about 50 to 60,000 rubles. You can make this build using the same ADAR conversion method from earlier though, which might also save you a little bit of cash. I've also got the same upgraded receiver on this build, the lightweight TX15 receiver off the flea market, just to get some extra base stats without spending too much. First up, the muzzle device on this build is the Thunderbeast 223 caliber muzzle brake, which then allows you to attach the Thunderbeast Ultra 5 suppressor. This combo was in the game for quite a while, but in the 12.9 patch, it has suddenly become one of the best options instead of being a budget piece. Next, you want to add the MK12 gas block from the previous build, and then for the handguard, we're going with the Mark 10 AR-15 handguard, sold by Mechanic Level 3. This handguard has great stats for the price, and you'll need the Alexander Arms 10-inch rail guide to add attachments to it. For the grip, I'm using the trusty Zenit RK1 here on this build, which is still pretty useful on M4s even after being nerfed in the 12.9 patch. However, if you want some extra ergonomics on the build, you can also go for the Hera Arms CQR grip for a bit more money on the flea market. I've also got the X400 on here as usual, but replace this with whatever you prefer in this slot. For the stock on this build, I've chosen the MOE carbine stock with the rubber butt pad attachment for reduced recoil. This combo is one of the best in the game right now and will get you a nice combination of ergonomics and recoil. The pistol grip here is the Naro Arms Graal S pistol grip, which is sold by Peacekeeper Level 4. If you don't have this unlocked, or you want to save some money, just use the Hogue grip from the last build instead. For the sight here, I'm using the EOTech XPS30 hollow sight, which is sold by Peacekeeper or on the flea market. Finally, I've got a Raptor charging handle on this build and an MBUS rear iron sight for some extra ergonomics. But both of these parts are optional if you're not too concerned about 3 points of ergonomics. When it's all put together, you've got 45 points of recoil and about 55 ergonomics total, which brings it into a nice range to be able to spray effectively, have nice tap shots at long range, and just enough ergonomics to aim faster. For the cost on this build, you're looking at roughly 200 to 220,000 rubles total, depending on flea market prices and on whether you build this from an M4 or using the cheaper ADAR barrel. This build is a good one to upgrade once you hit level 40 though, so I'll quickly go over my tips for what you can swap if you want to make this build even better and great for endgame PvP. First, you want to swap the MK12 gas block for the JP Gas System 6, which gives you a little bit more recoil reduction. Next, swap the upper receiver to the VLTOR MUR1S upper, which is a bit expensive but improves the stats quite a bit. Finally, one key part you can add to any M4 build at level 40 is the SI Advanced Buffer Tube, which is only about 10,000 rubles but adds a lot to the build. If you add these upgrades, the build comes out with about 36 recoil and around 60 ergonomics for about 230 to 250,000 rubles total. Either of these setups work pretty well, but personally, I really love this build once you hit level 40 and can add the extra parts to really bring the recoil down. Finally, we come to the last build, the full-length meta recoil build for the M4 in the 12.9 patch. This one has seen the most changes in the 12.9 patch, and a lot of the previously best-in-slot parts have been swapped out because of how things changed with the rebalancing. Performance-wise, it's much the same as it used to be, but the ergonomics has taken a pretty huge hit, going from close to 100 in the 12.8 patch to about 50 in the 12.9 patch. The recoil is still very low though, so that hasn't changed one bit. This build can actually be built from the ground up if you just buy an M4A1 receiver from Mechanic like I recommended in the first build. But you can also use an M4 that you already have as the base and just sell off everything except the lower receiver. First up, you'll need the VLTOR MUR1S upper, which improves the base stats quite a bit, and then add the 20-inch AR-15 barrel from Peacekeeper, which improves your muzzle velocity and recoil stats. For the gas block, you want to use the JP Gas System 6 from Mechanic Level 4, which gives you a nice little recoil reduction for the build. Next up, the muzzle device starts with the Blackout 51T flash hider, which then allows you to attach the AAC SDN6 suppressor, the new best-in-slot muzzle combination for both 5.56 and 7.62 rifles in the 12.9 patch. This is quite an expensive setup though, even more than the previously best-in-slot Wave suppressor, which was also really expensive. And if you want, you can just use the Thunderbeast parts from the mid-tier build and save yourself quite a bit on the suppressor. Next, the handguard here is the SAI 14.5-inch quad rail handguard, which is still the best-in-slot part and will run you a hefty 41,000 rubles at skier level 4. Just make sure that you buy the 14.5-inch option and not the shorter one, because I get comments all the time from people saying that they can't add the handguard to the build. You'll need a 4.1 inch M-lock rail to add a grip, and for this one, I went with the Fortis Shift grip because you need the extra ergonomics on this build. You can also use the RK2 grip for maximum recoil reduction, but you lose about 12 points of ergonomics for only 2 points of recoil. For the stock on this build, you start with the SI Advanced Buffer Tube for the extra base stats, then add the Magpul PRS Gen 3 stock, which is pretty expensive, but is also the best overall stock in the 12.9 patch. For the pistol grip, I went with the Graal S on this build as well, because currently it is one of the best in slot options and is much less expensive compared to the PSG1 grip. Finally, I've added a pair of MBUS iron sights for the extra ergonomics, and then I also added the Avalanche Mod 2 charging handle from Peacekeeper level 4 to get some more ergonomics. For the sight, I'm again using an EOTech hollow sight, and I've also got the X400 flashlight on here for my tactical device. When it's all put together, you've got 32 recoil and about 52 ergonomics. The recoil is still as low as ever, but as you can see, the ergonomics has taken quite a hit compared to previous patches. You can use the RK2 to get the recoil down to 29, but then the ergo falls all the way down to 40, so I don't really think that it's worth it personally. This build is surprisingly expensive as well, coming in at over 320,000 rubles total. I even checked my math twice on that because it seemed way too high, but the longer barrel, the expensive stock, and the very expensive suppressor combination quickly made the prices add up to way higher than they used to be. If you want to cut some costs, you can use a cheaper stock, the Thunderbeast suppressor, and swap the foregrip and pistol grip out for something cheaper, but it's going to be quite expensive no matter what you do. Well, that about covers it for my first look at the top 3 M4A1 builds in the 12.9 patch. Some things will likely change over the coming months as parts are added or rebalanced, but at first glance, I would say these are the builds that I recommend for the early, mid, and end game stages. While the M4 is still one of the lowest recoil assault rifles in the game, it has gotten quite a bit more expensive to build them, and many of the old cost-effective parts just don't cut it anymore. I would honestly like to see a buff to compensators for the M4, since you basically need an expensive suppressor in 12.9, and I think it would really help the diversity of builds if people could use compensators or suppressors, instead of just having to use suppressors. In any case, I hope you enjoy the builds, and let me know what you think down in the comments. Thanks for checking out the video. I've got links to my Twitch stream, Discord server, and Patreon page down below for anyone interested. And until next time, stay safe in Tarkov City.